I'm Ralph Miljanich, and I'm the president of the board of directors for the Community Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight, and I'd especially like to welcome you to the Richard and Mary Solari Community Room at the Foundation, and Mary is honoring us, and we're so pleased to have her here tonight. Right here, wait, raise your hand. Today's event is California Futures, Demographic Trends, Economic Shifts, and Leadership Challenges. This presentation is part of the Foundation's effort to offer opportunities to learn more about the issues and resources in Santa Cruz County, and we're very happy to have all of you here joining us. As you can see, this is being televised for community television. I think it'll be airing in about 3 weeks, and you can go to their Facebook page and their website to find those dates and times. We also have copies of Uncommon Common Ground, which is the book that Dr. Pastor has written, and that is outside in the lobby. So my job is just about over. Again, thank you very much for being here. This is very nicely dovetailing into the work that our board is doing presently. We now have this new building, and in many ways we're addressing the issues that a lot of organizations are addressing. Where do we go from here? And how do we participate in this community more fully and in alignment with what the needs are of the community? So it's all part and parcel of learning and opportunities for you as well as for our board. Maybe we could just have the board of directors raise their hands. We do have quite a few folks from the board of directors. Raise them up so they can see them, Leola. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Christina Cuevas, who will introduce our esteemed speaker. So thank you.
Thanks, Ralph, and welcome to all of you as well. I'm very honored to be able to introduce Dr. Pastor this afternoon. I'm actually a stand-in for Dr. Marty Chemers, who was formerly the Dean of the Social Sciences Division and the Interim Chancellor at UCSC. And it was actually while Marty was at UC that he helped start the Center for Justice, Tolerance, and Community, which Dr. Pastor spearheaded in the year 2000. And so many of you are probably familiar with Manuel's work here that he did in the center, and even before and certainly after. So I'm not going to give him a long introduction other than to say we are really so happy to welcome him back to Santa Cruz County. I know that as Ralph said, many of us are looking forward to the future and what the changing demographics mean in terms of our work in various sectors. And many of us have already been helped in the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector with the research that Dr. Pastor has done in the past. And I'm sure that we'll continue to benefit from that work. Currently, Dr. Pastor is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California, where he directs the program for environmental and regional equity, and is also the co-director of the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. His recent book, Uncommon Common Ground, Race in America, is available here for you to purchase at a big discount price, so we'll hope you'll take advantage of that. And I wanted to make one last plug, and that is, in addition to all the work that you know about that Dr. Pastor and his staff have done, he was also instrumental in evaluating a statewide census project here in California that many foundations across the state, including ours, participated to make sure that we reached out to the hard to count in the 2010 census. And so a lot of that information Dr. Pastor is also going to be bringing us today specific to Santa Cruz County. So please join me in welcoming Manuel Pastor.
Just got to make sure this is actually working. It's always good for your PowerPoint to have power, particularly since so few PowerPoints have a point. So fascinating. It's actually not working. So there we go. Now it is working. Well, thanks. I'm really glad to be here. I want to thank Christina for that kind introduction. And I also want to thank her for mentioning several times that book, Uncommon Common Ground, which, by the way, is an extraordinary book, probably one of my favorites of all time. And for those of you who are not readers, although you should buy it, it's about to be made into a major motion picture. I'm going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas, and I'm very excited about it. Very excited, too, to be in Santa Cruz, where I spent 12 years of my professional life as a professor, but actually was an undergraduate here between 1973 and 1978 at UC Santa Cruz, a period of time with numerous embarrassing incidents that I will not mention. So let me talk a little bit about where we're headed. And one of the things I think that I'm going to try to do is to move us past some of the short-term kind of politics and considerations of the immediate moment that we tend to get caught up on, and have a chance to spend a little bit of time on some of the long-term trends that are affecting all of our work here in California. And those long-term trends have to do with the changing demography of the state. And it's a state whose demography changed actually before the rest of the country's changed, and it foreshadowed a lot of the change that's going to occur in the rest of the country. We'll get to that. A little bit about the economic changes and transitions, particularly the ones that are affecting us now and will be affecting Santa Cruz County. But what I really want to end up on is talking a little bit about the leadership challenges that presents. What does it mean for us to lead in these difficult times, to build bridges, to cross boundaries, to build ties between constituencies in a way that will help really rescue the state, and in a way that will really be responsive to the conditions of Santa Cruz County as well. So now those of you who've been in a class realize that what I just did was tell you what I'm about to say. I'm now about to say it, which means that many of you will doze off for the next 45 minutes, but then you'll come back at the end for a sort of stirring and emotional conclusion, as well as a quiz. So as I said, that California is changing, and we need to be prepared by addressing social and economic inequities now. One point I want to make is that the issue of dealing with inequity is not a luxury. Usually it's thought of something that we can do only in good times. It's actually something that's very critical given the changing demography of the state. And then finally, that this is going to require a new kind of leadership. So first thing to realize is, what does the new census tell us? And the new census tells us something very interesting. We'll get to California in a minute, but this is for the nation. It's now predicted by the year 2042 that the United States will become a majority-minority nation, or as I prefer to think of it, all minority all the time. And I think about it that way because what it means is that in a world in which no single group is a majority, then the coalitional skills of building a cross-group become incredibly important to leadership. So by 2042, we will be a majority-minority country. By 2019 or 2020, it's predicted that the majority of folks under the age of 18 will be people of color. And it's probably this year that the majority of births will be to people of color in the United States as a whole. Now, so the U.S., which was 83% non-Hispanic white in 1970, will be about 46% non-Hispanic white in the year 2050. And of course, California has been through this before. By the way, if you look at this, it's about 69%, a little bit over two-thirds white in 2000, about 46% white for the country as a whole in the year 2050. That process that America will go through between the year 2000 and 2050 is what California went through between the years 1980 and 2000. That is, we went from being about two-thirds white to being about 47% non-Hispanic white. Now, demographers say they know the exact day that happened. You know how they do that? They go like the 300 millionth baby was born today. His name is Jose. He lives in Live Oak. How do you know that, right? Well, on December 15th, 1999, it was apparently the day it happened, and I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long saying, California's majority, minority, majority, minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? There was a little bit of anxiety in their voice. And finally, I got frustrated and said, I have no idea. But we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited. They just need to learn a new step. And part of what we're doing, of course, is learning a new step through that demographic change. Now, this is something that's also been going on in Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz County, which was 74% white in 1990, is in 2008, and the 2010 numbers will come into this chart in a little while. It was about 62% non-Hispanic white. A lot of the figures you're going to see on Santa Cruz County come from a project that we did for a group called CAUSE, Coastal Alliance United for Sustainable Economy. They're based in Ventura and Oxnard, but they're trying to do organizing all up and down the Central Coast. So we did a project for them trying to profile the economics and demography of all different parts of the Central Coast. And here you can see what Santa Cruz looked like. This is in the year 1980. These are by census tracts. The browner the census tract, the browner the census tract. So this is sort of the browner the census tract, the higher the percent Latino. What's interesting is in 1980, in terms of census tracts, there were more than 25% Latino. In 1980, that was pretty much the Watsonville area, but you can see that there were more light spots through the rest of the county. This is what it looks like in 2010 with the new census. We'll do that again, just because I like the wow. You can see that the Watsonville area spreads out in this direction, that you see the Live Oak area changing, and you also see the Santa Cruz area becoming more Latino. Rio Del Mar seems to be Rio Del Mar over this whole period of time. So, what's driving this demographic change? One of the things that's really interesting to realize about the demographic change in the United States, and it's the easiest way to think about it is to look a little bit at what's happened in the rest in California in particular, is that in the last census, the growth rate of Latinos between 2000 and 2010 for the country as a whole was 46%. The growth rate of Asian Pacific Islanders between 2000 and 2010, 46%. The growth rate between 2000 and 2010, country as a whole for African Americans, 11%. Growth rate for non-Hispanic whites, 1%. That's a huge difference. Now, when people hear this gigantic increase in the numbers of Latinos, what do they think is driving that? Well, births is the right answer, but what do most people think? Immigration, right? It is no longer driving the demographic growth of Latinos in the United States. It's no longer driving it, and in fact, immigration has been tapering off to the United States for the last couple of years. Not simply because of the increased enforcement at the border or the slower economy, but because of the reduced fertility rates that are going on in Mexico, where the fertility rates, that is the number of women per number of children per woman, has actually come fairly close to the U.S. level. And while the U.S. economy, while the Mexican and South American economies are no great shakes, they're in fact growing more rapidly and more sustainably than what's happening in the United States. So the push factors pushing people out have dramatically changed. And while most people in the United States commonly are concerned about the degree of immigration that we're going to face, demographers are worried that we're not going to have enough immigrants in the future for the workforce that we need. So it's really changing. I'll say one other thing that's really changing, which is interesting about this, but for immigrants in Los Angeles County who arrived in the last 10 years, for immigrants who arrived in the last 10 years in LA County, what percent of them do you think are Mexican? Recent immigrants into LA County? 50%? 20%? What does the public think? 150%, right? Super Mexicans are arriving, right? They cross the border and say, I count for 1.5, right? Only 1/3 of the recent immigrants into LA County are Mexican. It's a very diverse flow. It's a diverse flow now coming into the rest of the country. And in fact, the share of foreign-born in California is on the decline, and the share of foreign-born in Los Angeles County has been on the decline for the last 3 years. If you look at immigration into the country, and here what's an interesting graph, what it does is it takes California out from the rest of the country, something which, given our fiscal crisis, the rest of the country would think is a good idea. You can see that the share of foreign-born was dramatically increasing up until about 2007 in California, which made people think it was happening in the country as a whole. But essentially, the share of foreign-born was pretty flat until the 1990s and the 2000s. That's when it started growing in the rest of the country. So the new arrivals in places like North Carolina, et cetera, that's something that's kind of come a bit later. Once again, California has been ahead of this demographic change. And we will continue to be ahead of this demographic change. This is what California's demography is projected looking forward. So in the year 2000, we were about 47% white, about 32% Latino, about 6% African American, 11% API. And you can say Asian Pacific Islanders. You can see that by 2010, the share of whites in the state has fallen, and it's projected to continue to fall over time until it's about 26% in the year 2050. The group that is essentially trading places is the Latino population. That will be a majority somewhere after year 2040 in California. These are, by the way, the official California projections. So by the year 2041, everyone will have to say California the right way. People will learn to say Santa Cruz as Santa Cruz, right? Watsonville will always be Watsonville. What does that look like geographically? This is the percent people of color by county in the year 2000. And here's the darker the color shade going from yellow to a brown, the higher the percent people of color. So that's the year 2000. And the breaks are 20% or less, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, et cetera. As we move to the year 2010, you can see that there's been massive demographic change throughout the state. You can see that that change will continue to take place, interestingly, in the Inland Empire and in the Central Valley, right? Which is not where people sort of think. They think it's going to be happening on the coast. But one of the interesting things about the metropolitan areas is the following thing. This, I think, is absolutely fascinating. Of the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, places like Salt Lake City and Houston, Texas, and New York and Charlotte, North Carolina, the 100 largest metropolitan areas, what do you think is the only metropolitan area, large metro area, that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children? That's the correct answer, Los Angeles. Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is a maturing population. Both its Latino population is getting older, having less kids, and there's a movement more of basically young whites and others to stay in the city of Los Angeles, in the coastal areas, and a lot of the movement has been to places in the Inland Empire and moving into places like the Central Coast. So that's the year 2020, that's the year 2030, that's the year 2040, and that's the year 2050 in terms of demographic change. So you can tell your friends who live kind of all the way through here that if they were worried that they did not have a good taqueria near them, as we say in Spanish, no te preocupes, don't worry, one is coming to rescue you from Taco Bell. So what does that mean for Santa Cruz County? What's interesting about Santa Cruz County, look at the demographic change for the state as a whole going from 2000 to 2050, where the Latino population will go from 2000, 32%, for the state as a whole, 52%. Santa Cruz, the change is more dramatic. That is from 27% Latino in 2000 It's going to be a steady increase till about 61% in the year 2050, according to the demographic projections. So Santa Cruz County, as it prepares for its future, is going to have to be thinking about an increasingly Latino population, very small African American population, slight increases in the Asian Pacific Islander population over time. So that's what Santa Cruz County is also looking forward to, according to the state and its official projections. The other interesting thing about Santa Cruz County is that it has been an aging population, an aging population. And what's interesting about this, it's actually kind of different than the rest of the state. So first, this is the population under the age of 18. It's gone from 23% in 1990 to 24%, 2000, 22%, in the year 2008. Some of this data winds up being a year or two old, and the reason why is technical. The new census data only counts ethnicity and age. The American Community Survey, which is 1 or 2 years back, winds up counting some of the poverty and socioeconomic issues. So if you really want to look at those, you've got to use the ACS data. So one of the things, if you look here, is that the young population is staying about the same. The population that's actually growing in Santa Cruz County as a share is the population that's 46 to 55 and 55 to 65. It's those baby boomers who came here and tasted the Santa Cruz nectar and refused to leave. Now, one of the interesting things about that population is that a lot of them are in this room, number one. But number two is that, you know, one of the things that I mean, I don't know about you, but, you know, I remember kind of when I was, you know, 22, and then I remember when I was 30, and I remember when I was 35, and man, I feel like I'm still that guy, right? But like, I ain't, right? I'm 55, right? And in 10 years, I'll be 65, right? That population that's staying is going to age. The population that will be increasingly dependent on will be a younger population of color. And the issue is, what is the generational compact about investing in each other that will allow us to move forward? This is important because the dependency ratio, and unfortunately we did not chart Santa Cruz County in here, but the dependency ratio is the percent of those above the age of 64 and those below the age of 18 as a share of the working age population. So how many people, if you've got workers, are essentially going to be supported by those workers? And you can see that as we project forward into the California future, the dependency ratio is going to sharply increase till about the year 2030, 2040, and then stabilize. What does that mean? That means for those who are retired and for those who are young, the folks who will keep them moving economically are the folks who are 20 and 25 now. And we have to ask the question, is our public school system, is our university system, is our social compact making the right kind of investments to keep them productive over time? By the way, the simple answer to that is no, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So what does that mean, excuse me, in Santa Cruz in particular? And excuse me for both the water and mic. Many of you know that actually over the last year, and part of the reason why I use the mic now is that I developed a speech disorder that's called spasmodic dysphonia. And what it does is the only way it gets treated actually is with Botox shots to your neck, which is why I look so damn good. But it also sort of makes you feel a little choky sometimes. So it's not really that emotional, but it's in there. So what does that mean for the California economy, and what do we need to think about as we lead forward? So first thing to realize is that, you know, Santa Cruz and the Central Coast are actually somewhat well off compared to the rest of California. The median household income in the Central Coast, which is sort of Monterey and Santa Cruz, but also stretching down into San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, Ventura, it's actually pretty high relative to California, and this shows you the levels of income for 89, 99, and 2008. However, we've become much more unequal as a state, and by the way, Santa Cruz, as you'll see in a second, has been really helping lead the way in that level of inequality. California used to be a place where people would come to make their fortunes, to make their opportunities, thinking that this was a place where you could always find a job, could always forge a future. My family actually moved here from New York in 1956, shortly after I was born. We actually moved here for the economy, but we also moved here because my sister had asthma, and the doctors in New York recommended that our family move to Los Angeles. I believe this was the era when doctors were saying that smoking Camel filters would actually toughen your lungs up for the future. But one of the things that happened was that was a tremendous time of great economic prosperity and opportunity, and we were really one of the most equitable states in the country. This is a fancy statistic called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient essentially measures inequality in your state. We are now the 7th most unequal state in the country. We're a little bit less unequal than Texas or Mississippi. Wow. But we're ahead. We're more unequal than Alabama and Georgia and Kentucky and Arkansas, places we've always looked to as beacons of social justice. So one of the things is that we've become a much more unequal state, and it's very clear when you take a look at what's been happening to median household income growth by percentile. So the yellow is for California, the bluish is for Santa Cruz County. What this says is what's happening to the folks at the 10th percentile of the income distribution, what's happening to folks at the 20th percentile of the income distribution, at the 50th percentile of the income distribution, the 80th percentile, and 90th percentile. So the 90th percentile means 90% of the households are poorer, 10% are wealthier, the 50th is basically the median. Does that make sense to folks? So what you can see is that in California, we've had a widening divide where those in the top have been gaining income, the middle has been losing, and there's been slippage on the bottom. Santa Cruz has had even more slippage on the bottom, some gains in the middle, but significant gains at the top of the income distribution. Some of that, because it's from '89 to 2008, reflects the technology spillover and the way in which that has contributed to a changing distribution of income in Santa Cruz County and a changing distribution of housing opportunities as well. And you can see this by looking at what's happened to where poverty is. This is the percent below 150% of the poverty line in 1980. And one thing that's interesting here is it includes parts of Santa Cruz, partly because of those damn students. They're poor, right? But you can see that it included Watsonville back then. For the most recent data, one of the things that's kind of interesting is to watch that what's happened is that the poverty has thinned out in some kinds of ways, but it's moved a little bit to the east, shifted a little bit, and all the way through these areas that are the lightest areas, meaning have the lowest poverty rates, is where you've seen this kind of Silicon Valley commuter move in, right? And so it's led to significant inequality in the community. It's unequal, of course, by race as well. This is for California, and you can see that African Americans and Latinos have much lower levels of household income. In Santa Cruz County, actually African American household income has been quite high, but that's because it's such a small sample of people. It's pretty unreliable numbers. For the Latino population, very, very much lower levels of income. The unemployment rate in Santa Cruz County has generally tracked the California rate, but with a much more volatility because of the reliance on agriculture. But what that means is that Santa Cruz County now is facing all of those issues that the entire state of California is facing with high levels of unemployment. And I'm going to jump over these things to talk a little bit about, to kind of bring this to a close, partly because I think that the questions and answers will be the most interesting part of this. And also because while economists love graphs, not everyone does. It's also said about economists, if you took all the economists in the world and you laid them end to end, they still couldn't reach a conclusion. Others have said if you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, that would be a good thing. Particularly given how economics did so well at predicting this last crisis. So one of the things to realize that's happened in California is that the returns to education have shifted dramatically in the state. It always used to be the case that it was important for you to get an education to get a degree, meaning that if you went from not having high school to completing high school to at least going to college to getting an AA or to getting a BA or better, that your wage would go up. And the blue line here is what the wage gradient was in 1979, adjusted into current dollars. So, if you got more education, your wage went up. This is what the wage gradient in California looks like in 2009, meaning that if you lack a high school degree, the penalty is bigger than it was in the past. If you have a BA or better, the gain is bigger than it was in the past. So it's not just that education matters, it's that education matters more than it ever did. And we have a severe set of disparities in terms of the education levels of our population and where the jobs will be in the future. This is a graph that I think is important, and so I will take a moment to explain it. So this is the educational requirements for California of the jobs that are projected for the future, whereas 60% of them will require less than an associate's degree, 12% will require an associate's degree, 29% will require a bachelor's degree or higher. So one of the things that you'll note about this, and by not requiring less than an associate's degree, that generally means either they're short-term on the job training, could be long-term on the job training, but it doesn't require an associate's degree. There's not a huge mismatch in the state. There'll be a few too many bachelors relative to the jobs, a few too many people with less than an associate's degree relative to the jobs. We're going to see a lot of squeezing. But if you look at the non-Hispanic white population, high levels of having a bachelor's degree, the API, or Asian Pacific Islander population, both for the U.S. born and immigrant, very high levels of having a bachelor's degree. But if you look at the African American and Latino populations, not just the immigrant population, but the U.S. born as well, very low levels of having a college degree, very low levels of having an associate degree, very high levels, particularly for the Latino population, of being high school dropouts. What that means is that as the economy rolls forward, if we don't pay attention, the current inequality we're seeing will actually get worse. Does that make sense? Okay. So, what does it mean? So let me say a couple things about what I think it means. The first thing I think it means is that we need to understand something very fundamental. In the last census, at a national level, the statistic that keeps grabbing everyone's attention is the one I first mentioned, that Latinos grew by 43%, that Asian Pacific Islanders grew by 43%, that African Americans grew by 11%, that non-Hispanic whites grew by 1%. That is a pretty striking statistic. But here's the statistic that should really be grabbing your attention. The median age for non-Hispanic whites in the United States is 41 years, meaning half the people are older, half the people are younger. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders is 35 years. The median age for African Americans is 32 years. The median age for Latinos is 27 years. 41 years, 27 years, that is essentially a generation gap. And we have been taking a look at that generation, and that's part of the reason why, by the way, it's the birth rates driving things, because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation years. 41, usually you're past that. We've been taking a look at that generation gap, essentially by taking a look at the percent of the population above the age of 65 that's white relative to the percent of the population below the age of 18 that's kids of color. So for example, in California, that percent of the population above the age of 18, above the age of 65 that's white, is about 63%. Now what's true about people above the age of 65? They don't have children. They have children, right? But they're not having children. What else? They rely on Social Security, Medicare. What else? They have great medical costs. They vote, right? They vote a lot, right? By the way, that's a good answer. When I ask my students that, they usually say they'll die soon. It's an answer I'm incredibly uncomfortable with at the age of 55. So in California, the population above the age of 65 is about 63% white. The population below the age of 18 is 70% kids of color. That is a generation gap. And that generation gap, you might say to yourself, oh my gosh, it's, what kind of consequence can that have? Let me give you a couple of consequences it does have. By the way, there's a wonderful book by Peter Schrag called Paradise Lost, written about 10 or 12 years ago, that bemoaned this, foresaw this generation gap and bemoaned the fact that the older generation was not seeing themselves in the younger generation. So where that generation gap is the largest for U.S. states, state spending on capital infrastructure per person is the lowest. That is, investment in physical capital is the lowest. Where the generation gap between the old and the young, the demographic generation gap, is the biggest, state spending on education per pupil is the lowest. And by the way, what state in the United States do you think has the biggest generation gap, the whitest old, the brownest young?
Texas.
So many good guesses. Arizona. And is it any wonder, right, that they're having this heated fight around immigration, that they're having this heated fight around ethnic studies, that they're shooting themselves in the foot when they've had an economy shipwrecked by speculation, and their whole strategy is how can we deport some immigrants, right? Now, we are finding something very important, which is that the racial divide in the United States has become a generational divide. And when you start to think about that very famous sign that a Tea Party person was carrying, the one that said, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare," which people laughed about because they said, oh gosh, that's so irrational because it's really a government program, right? But that's read by some people as being irrational. It's read by others as saying, my God, it's an older generation lifting up the drawbridge just as a newer generation is arriving. Because that older generation, that greatest generation, called great, a great generation because of their participation in World War II, was made great because there was a GI Bill to make sure that they could buy houses, because there was FHA loans that, by the way, were basically built on racially restrictive covenants to make sure that white people could buy houses. There was money being spent on a freeway system. We were generating public education. We were generating a world-class university system. The greatest generation was made great by public investment. And keeping your government hands off my Medicare is announcing that the drawbridge is coming up just as a new generation is arriving. And that is a really serious problem, because if we do not invest and make this next generation more productive, then we will not have a healthy economy looking forward. And this message, and we can talk more about it, is actually getting out not simply to those who are progressive and already liberals and on the left and in philanthropy and who live in Santa Cruz. It's getting out to business people as well, who are really looking out and seeing who the workforce will be, who the consumers will be, and how do we actually make things move rolling forward. So we have to begin to make an argument that equity and dealing with these racial divides is no longer simply a luxury, no longer simply something that we do because we're people of goodwill and we have good impulses. It's something that's absolutely essential to the economic health of the state and to the economic health of the United States. We also have to understand the importance of policy and advocacy, particularly for those of you who are in the philanthropic world. And by the way, did you notice at the beginning that all the board members sat on one side, right? That's interesting. It's a little bit like, all the students who sit in the back or something. But one of the things I think that is really important to understand is that the investments you make in model programs are not enough unless there's actually also investments in advocacy and policy change. We tend to think about this, the groups that I work with, as being a sort of troika of three things: programs, policy, and power. That programs demonstrate what's possible. Policy makes the possible standard operating procedure, but it's power that changes policy. And if what you think you're doing is investing in model programs as though someone will someday slap their forehead and go, gosh, we weren't investing in these Latino kids, why didn't we do that? You need to also be thinking about how we scale up to do policy, and how do we invest in the community organizing and engagement that leads policy change to take place. This is also going to mean that we need to think about the fact that collaboration and conflict actually go together. Sometimes, by the way, I'm always surprised when I get invited back to speak to philanthropic audiences, because I'm generally saying things that I think I'm supposed to piss them off. Sometimes in the foundation world, when people hear the word collaboration, what they tend to think of is people all getting along. Like that, how many of you have been to Disneyland? You know that little ride, It's a Small World After All? All the children are singing? Is collaboration like that? I think of collaboration as principled conflict, right? That is, you collaborate with people you disagree with. If you were collaborating with people you agree with, you were already on the same team, right? Collaboration is principled conflict. You've got conflicts with people, you've got principles you share, both about what your goals might be and about how you're going to carry that conflict through in a way that is honorable, in a way that respects each other's different interests and norms, in a way that's civil. We need to understand that conflict is an important part of change. And then finally, we need to think about what does it mean to lead. And I wanted to end with a story that actually comes, and I think maybe the only person here who's heard this before is Johnny Fox, who's in the audience. Johnny and I and a number of other colleagues at UC Santa Cruz used to run something called the Summer Institute, Social Change Across Borders, that brought together activists from Latin America and Latino communities in the United States to come together, and this was in the 1990s, to think about transnational organizing as the future. Carlos Palacios actually was part of the original group helping to think this through, and this was sort of before everybody was thinking about transnationalism. So we felt like we were pretty hip, right? And at the end of one of these sessions, there was an organizer named Victor Quintana from Sinaloa, who said, you know, there's only two kind of leaders in this world. Leaders who like the game of chess and leaders who like the jigsaw puzzle. And I know, we were like you. We were looking at Victor going, what are you talking about, right? And Victor said, well, in chess, the pieces, they're only of two colors. In the jigsaw puzzle, the pieces are many different colors, and indeed, a single piece can be multi-hued. In chess, one piece is far more powerful than another. You are totally bummed out when you lose your queen. In the jigsaw puzzle, every piece is important. You need every piece to be able to complete the puzzle. In chess, the way you move ahead is by literally knocking a piece from where it was and taking its territory. In the jigsaw puzzle, you move ahead, you make progress by putting the pieces together so seamlessly that you do not know where one ends and another begins. In chess, the object is to win. In the jigsaw puzzle, the object is to complete the tapestry. We, as a nation, have been playing too much chess and not enough jigsaw puzzle. We've been dividing old against young. We've been dividing people of color against whites. We've been dividing rich against poor. We've been dividing red states against blue states. We've been dividing folks against folks, cities against suburbs, thinking that somehow we're not all part of one fabric, one people, one state. If we can begin to play a little bit more jigsaw puzzle, if we can begin to show a little bit more leadership about weaving our communities together, we can begin to recognize what it is that we need to do to really make change both in the state and in Santa Cruz County. Thank you.
Manuel didn't mention at the start, but I will now. Under your chairs, there are 3x5 cards and pencils. If you have specific questions you'd like Dr. Pastor to address, please take a moment and write them down, and we'll collect them. I'm going to start with one because I know people need a little time to reflect and write. But Manuel, many of us are aware of the change and interests and how the future is going to look. And recently, the Pew Charitable Trust commissioned a study about the changing demographics, and their analysis was not many people cared, and they weren't that interested. So what's your experience with people's concern and interest, and what do you think are ways people can start building these relationships and renewing the generational compact?
So I think that part of what emerges in that Pew study is, people that say that they're not concerned, but I'm going to talk about two places that they definitely are concerned. But they say they're not concerned in part because I'm always struck by, many of you probably watch Stephen Colbert, and he always says, I don't see race, right? I'm told I'm a white man, he says, but I don't see race, right? I think race is an incredibly uncomfortable thing to talk about in the United States. White people feel like they're about to say the wrong thing if they're of goodwill. People of color don't want to talk about it because we want to be seen through that single prism, which would reduce all of who we are to just one thing rather than complex people that we may be. So I think people are really uncomfortable. So we need to get comfortable. And I think part of what people do is to erase it. I was listening the other day to a guy named Tim Wise, who does a lot of work on white racism, speaking at a conference in D.C. Just at the end of last week. And it was very interesting because he was pulling up polling data from the 1960s. And apparently in the 1960s, 65–70% of Americans thought that blacks had an equal shot and that basically nothing was standing in their way of advancing. And I think that we have the same sort of analysis now without asking the question of what neighborhoods do people live in, how does place matter, how do schools matter, etc. So I think part of why it shows up as people not being concerned is that we are very practiced at erasing these differences because we're so uncomfortable with talking and dealing with them. Now, when you look at the demographic of the Tea Party, older, whiter, anxious about change, it's hard to argue that's not being motivated, at least in part, by some anxiety over the changes that are taking place and the uncertainty that's happening economically. And I think that that's really telling. The other thing, as I mentioned, is that I find the group that's the most interested when I talk about these demographic changes and where there's the most opening and where we're not paying enough attention, particularly people who are progressives, is the business community. Because the business community is a little bit more looking and saying, gosh, those are the future workers, those are the future consumers, that is the future society, what have I got to do to adjust? Now, all the ways that they may want to adjust may not be the way that people who are on the more progressive slant of things want to adjust, but they're really quite striking. So let me tell you about one little thing that I think is just kind of an important victory. So I've been running this thing called the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, and we ran a project for the California Community Foundation, which is basically the Los Angeles Community Foundation, but of course because it's LA, it's so arrogant it just calls itself the California Community Foundation. And surely in 2007, before I got to USC, Antonio Hernandez used to be the executive director of MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and also the president of the California Community Foundation. She called me and said, my gosh, it looks like we're going to have comprehensive immigration reform, and we've got 1 million undocumented people in Los Angeles. We've got to prepare for this. Would you be willing to do a project to help us prepare? And I said, sure. I'm in the process of moving from Santa Cruz to LA, but when I get down there, I'll give you a call. So in the process of that move, as you may recall, comprehensive immigration reform did not pass, right? So, I get down there and I call Antonia, and she goes, you know what? We still have 1 million undocumented people in California and Los Angeles. We need to figure out how to integrate them. And so we've put together a Council on Immigrant Integration, which brings together immigrant rights activists, to be sure, but it also brings together city planners, business leaders, labor leaders, interethnic community builders, foundation people, basically people who never think that immigrants are their bailiwick, but in fact they are. So one of the first things we did was ask people on the council to go out to lunch with someone they normally don't spend time with. So this guy, David Rattray, from the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, chose to go out with Angelica Salas, who's head of Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights in LA. They started a relationship, and I'm proud to announce that last year, when the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce went to Congress to lobby for its legislative priorities, it had 3. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was the DREAM Act. The third was the DREAM Act because the Chamber of Commerce saw it in their interests to make sure that these kids who had been in our schools were able to successfully contribute to the California economy, and they also saw that it was critically important to be building ties with the immigrant community. There are allies that are unexpected allies if we can begin to build those bridges.
I'm glad that was a long answer because now I have a lot of questions to ask. Not at all. I have 2 here, and they're not necessarily linked, but they both deal with education. And since obviously you're not only a product of our fine system, but also continue to teach in California, the question is, access to higher education is becoming limited to the very wealthy. It's accelerated. The inequality of the project that you project is going to influence this. What can our state do, given the situation, the financial situation here, about public education? And then the second part, which may or may not be related or linked, but where do you think bilingual education fits into all of this?
So let me give you an answer to the first question, which may not be the answer that you would expect. We need to raise the naturalization rates of immigrants, particularly in the Inland Empire and the Central Coast, so we can vote out enough Republicans so we can have a 2/3 majority to pass the taxes that we need in the state. The rest of it doesn't make any difference. I mean, it really doesn't. I mean, until we get a 2/3, we either have to strike down the 2/3 rule in terms of raising taxes in the state, or we need to get 2/3. It's a little bit easier to get 2/3. You know, the Republicans which pushed on the, by the way, this is the reason why I don't work in a foundation, because I can just say shit. You know, the Republicans pushed very hard in this redistricting commission, and they're really surprised that the results came out that, you know, not only are there more Latino districts, but Latinos kind of don't like them right now, right? And that there are more districts that are likely to go Democratic. That can be really pushed along by raising naturalization rates of those who are eligible. That would have just a huge impact on changing the politics, and Johnny's been working on this for years, pushing people on this for years. It would really have a huge impact at the state level. Because the only way that we're going to address this, I feel like we've squeezed the public sector about as tightly as we can, and there were probably things to squeeze that we did need to squeeze. We are probably going to have to do pension reform, which people aren't really that enthusiastic about. We are going to have to do things that people who are progressive and democratic aren't really going to find all that palatable. We do need to do something about the education system in ways that we can talk about too. But in terms of higher ed, we need to get more money into the system. And that's going to require raising revenues. Now we need to do that at a national level too. That's going to be a little bit harder to push along. On the bilingual ed thing, I mean, I think bilingual ed is fantastic in terms of a real opportunity for folks to learn both languages. My wife was a bilingual teacher, both in Los Angeles and here in Santa Cruz, and ran bilingual programs in Santa Cruz. On the other hand, kids really want to learn English. Parents really want to make sure that they learn English. The other thing I think that we could do, I mean, if you want to ask what would really help, I was actually asked this, I was speaking in San Francisco today, and they said, what's the single best thing we could do for children in the state of California? And I said, flood the zone with adult English as a second language classes so that immigrants can learn English, move their job profiles up, be able to speak to teachers and negotiate systems, and be able to lobby more effectively. So I feel like we get hung up on the bilingual ed debate. I mean, I think it's a good thing. It's a great opportunity for people. People really want to learn English. They need to know English. And it's a kind of, you know, lie to say that they don't want to learn the language.
Okay, these next set of questions, and I'll go one at a time, let you answer them, are on totally different subjects. This one has to do with retirement and income. So in the period of '06 to '11, a significant number of middle-class folks between 30 and 55 have lost all or most of their savings, their retirement, in some cases their homes. So this is even bigger in the Latino population. What is this going to mean when retirement hits the state economy and the rising Latino elders?
Well, thank you all for the very easy questions. You know, that's actually true, and the thing that's gone on that folks don't think about a lot is that everybody lost a lot of wealth in this last recession through a combination of the destruction of wealth in the stock market and destruction of wealth in terms of home equity. That, though, particularly the latter, which is where most people get their wealth from, had a really significant impact in the African American and Latino communities, because for both those communities, home equity has been a much larger share of net personal wealth than it has been for whites traditionally. So the Pew Research Center, which does great research, did a thing on the changing wealth in the United States, and there's been a real differential in terms of wealth loss for Latinos and African Americans. So I think it's going to mean that people are going to be postponing retirement for quite some time. I also think it means that we're going to have to, you know, rethink again what our compact is to each other. I mean, we've got a situation fiscally in which what's going on is that older folks definitely don't want Medicare or Social Security touched. And I understand that. My dad passed away last year. Thank God he had Medicare, because for the last 2 years, he was able to stay in assisted living and have hospice come that was paid by Medicare. I know it saved the federal government money too, because it was hospice rather than a hospital. But it meant that he was comfortable for that last year and a half or 2 years. So older folks don't want that touched. Baby boomers don't want their taxes raised. And what's happening is that those who are sort of 25 to 45 are feeling a lot of economic pressure, and those who are under the age of 25 are not getting much of the public investment. We all need to pony up on this, right? And we need to get moving on kind of getting the economy going again. But it's going to be a really long haul, particularly restoring wealth, and particularly restoring housing wealth for most people.
Okay, take a deep breath. This one came from two separate cards, and both have to do with the topic of intermarriage, racial mixing, mixed race. Is there, in fact, an increase in mixed race births? And to what extent does the increase affect your projections?
One of my favorite questions. There has been an increase in mixed race births, but it's both a little bit slower than most people think, and second, there's been an interesting thing going on, which is that you would have expected, demographers would have expected, that the share of the population that identifies themselves as mixed race, now that we introduced that category in the 2000 census, that share would have been increasing over time. Wouldn't you have thought that? But it hasn't been. It hasn't been. Now, why? So I think there's a couple of different reasons for it. One of which is interesting. I mean, for example, in the last census, Barack Obama marked himself as black, not mixed race, right? So there's, you know, I guess when the president's doing that, that shows you something, right, about the way that he sees himself. But there's another thing going on which I think is pretty interesting, and it's that a lot of this so-called mixed race stuff is actually Latinos intermarrying with other groups, right? So, so my wife, Betsy Hamilton, and I have 2 children, Joaquin Tomas Pastor and Ana Elisa Pastor. But here's what's interesting. You know, and I'll tell you both what's going on in the data, and then also what an anecdote that really gets to it. What's going on in the data is that 1980 was the first time they asked people whether they were Hispanic or not. And then they first asked them actually what race they were, then they asked them whether they were Hispanic or not. And they were very frustrated because like 40% of Latinos marked themselves not as white or black or Asian, they marked themselves as other. So the census said, you know, I guess it was the first year we asked people if they were Hispanic, so they were confused, we'll do it again. So in 1990 they asked first what the race question is. What race are you, white or black? Asian, Native American, or other. And then they said Latino, non-Latino. And it turned out that 45% of Latinos marked themselves as other. And the census said, well, let's investigate this a little bit more. So they went and they started looking at the individual answers in the census, right? And it turns out a lot of people who mark like other, right? They were marking things like they'd mark other and then they'd write Chicano, right? Like really loud, you know, like with an exclamation point, right? And they said, well, you know what? It's the Latinos. They need to get it out of their system, right? So in order to figure out what race they are, what we're going to do is we're going to ask in 2000 the question, are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic first? Then we'll let them choose what race they are. So they did that, thinking finally the Latinos will get it right. And in the year 2000, more Latinos than ever marked themselves as other. 2010, there's been a bit of a switch. And the reason is that now in the census, it says, you've got to mark a race. It pretty much shouts in bold on the form that you've got to mark a race, you know, particularly if you're Latino, because we're tired of you, right? So what's going on there? What's going on there is that Latinos think about race, which is not to say that there isn't race in the Latino community or there aren't races, etc., but they tend to think about it in a different and more fluid way. And what it reminds me of is there's this great cartoon by Lalo, who's a Chicano cartoonist. I guess you don't say cartoonist. A Chicano cartoonist. And it's a great thing because it's the year like 2500 or something, and it looks like the Jetsons. All those homes are like up in the sky and flying saucers are going around, and two guys are sitting next to each other, and one guy's going, man, I wonder how everybody got along before everybody became Latino. So it's funny because what it appeals to is that sense of demographic change, but also what does it mean to be a community that says, oh yeah, we're white and we're black and we're Asian and we're Native and we're other, right? To be embracing of this. So I think that part of what's gone on is the Latino identity is kind of swamping for a lot of people the multiracial identity, because Latino can be inclusive if you're part Latino of being multiracial. So I think that's part of what's going on with those categories. It's a long answer, but it's a great cartoon.
One of our audience members has read your book on regional equities, and they'd like to know, as we all would, what could we, right here in our region in the Monterey Bay, do to prepare for the future that you're predicting?
So the first thing, that's a great question. I want to thank whoever read the book, too. So, you know, with the regional equity movement, for those of you who haven't been paying attention to it, I think some of you have, is something that's been around for about 8 to 9 years, and maybe a little bit longer, and I feel blessed to have been a little bit at the beginning of it. And part of it came out of work that we were doing in Los Angeles, where I was before coming to Santa Cruz, in which we were working on issues of community development in places like South LA and East LA, and we realized that even as we were doing that, the regional economy was sinking, and then it made a lot of attention to figure out how to tie people to opportunities in the regional economy and not simply where they lived. And kind of out of that grew a movement trying to ask the question, how could we be more fair within regions, and also beginning to realize something very essential, which is that at a regional level, people talk together face to face, place to place, race to race. And that the conversations that we can have at a regional level with other people can be the conversations that can build that kind of jigsaw puzzle mentality that certainly does not exist at a national level. It's very easy at a national level in Washington to kind of pass harsh immigration laws without realizing what impacts they have on real lives, right? You know, shortly before I left Santa Cruz, and some of you may remember this, there was a great rally that the Industrial Areas Foundation group here, COPA, did in Live Oak, and one of the people who spoke was a parent who had been the father and principal of the PTA at Brants Forty Elementary when my kids went there. And he spoke eloquently about the need for adult ESL classes and the need for the community college to do more outreach in the community, and the need for a new community center in Live Oak. And I remember walking out of that session thinking, man, this is great. This is really what democracy is about, when people stand up and talk to people, the powers that be, and really raise important issues about community development. And that evening, his house was raided, and he was picked up and deported because he was undocumented in the country. Had been in the country for 10 years, actually owned a business. He had been president of our PTA. His daughter was pretty close to being the valedictorian at that point at Harbor High. And he was picked up and deported. He'd actually been somebody who'd entered the country illegally, and he'd been someone who had tried to apply afterwards to get in legally and been kind of gone through a bad lawyer, etc. And, parents, all sorts of parents came together to say, geez, how could you toss out the guy who's the president of the PTA, right? You can if you're in Washington. You can if you're in Sacramento. You can if you've never met that person. You can't if you have. You can't if you have. And what the regional equity movement is all about is trying to think about equity on a neighbor-to-neighbor, person-to-person level, something that takes place more concretely at a regional level. So I think what you can do in Santa Cruz is organize, organize, organize. Get to know people, get to know who the neighbors are, recognize that those neighbors are very, very diverse, and then begin to think about what really is this region. In my view, this region sometimes suffers from not understanding that it's part of the Silicon Valley and that it's part of Monterey, and that whole band of communities rises and falls together. And if you can build those kind of ties, I mean, it's pretty easy to go, oh, that bad Silicon Valley, they have different values than we do, when in fact a lot of what they do helps drive the economy here, and a lot of what's going on in Monterey County is absolutely crucial to Santa Cruz County. So I think the biggest thing is organize, 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 set the scale big enough to understand what kind of economic region you're really part of, but begin to think about the neighbor-to-neighbor stuff that gets people to think through the real consequences of public policy.
Well, and the good news of the story there is that we do now have a community center in Live Oak and the Live Oak Resource Center, so some good thing came there. Someone wants to know, what are some promising strategies for changing the perspectives of the aging white population on investing in the younger generation and the crucial role of public investment in fostering prosperity for all?
So why don't I answer this, and then, I don't know, maybe one more or maybe none more, we'll see, because I'd love to talk to people individually too. So I'll say that I think that there's a couple of promising strategies. One is, making the economic argument concretely, and I have a colleague named Dowell Myers who wrote a wonderful book called Boomers and Immigrants, in which, he was a really wonderful guy to work with. I still work with him. He was co-director of the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration for a while. Tall, white baby boomer. Very convincing when he tells you that immigrants are the future. And basically his thing is, who do you want to buy your house, right? Someone who's like, undocumented and who doesn't have a lot of education and kids haven't had a lot of education, or someone who saw a path to citizenship, put their kids through good public schools, and winds up having a pretty good job so they can prop up your housing values, right? So I think there's an economic argument to be made. I actually think that the most promising thing is actually, though, one-on-one conversations. There was a great project that actually was launched by an SEIU organizer called SOUL, Strengthening Our Lives, SOL. And what they did was bring together Californians of different ages and demographies to have conversations about what brought you to California or your family, what makes California great, and what do you think your dreams are for California. And one of the things that was very interesting about that is beginning to see people understand each other's destinies and begin to work together a little bit more. Now, I think that this can be done. I've seen it happen. Most of the work I'm doing right now, actually, and I'll just tell a story that I find kind of interesting, is right now, because it's LA, we do a lot of work also with African American and Latino communities where there's a lot of proximity. We're releasing a report this week called All Together Now, African Americans, Immigrants, and the Future of California. One really compelling story out of that. I was asked to host and moderate, and I did, the 20th anniversary community session of a group called Community Coalition that works in South LA. And they brought together about 250 people who are their organizers and their constituents, etc. It's mostly African American and Latino. And this was an audience that was about 60% African American, 65% African American. And they were talking about parent organizing. And they brought up in front to talk about parent organizing this immigrant Latino who got up and started speaking and talked about being undocumented in the country, talked about losing wages sometimes, talked about sometimes being abused, but showing up all the time when he needed to for PTA meetings and parent meetings, etc., and that the single most important thing in his life was making sure that his kids had a good education. And when you're in a meeting where an audience that's 65% African American is standing up and applauding for an undocumented immigrant who cares about his kids, and then repairs to a series of workshops about what can they do together to make the school system in LA better, you know that you're making progress. And you make that progress by bringing people together to talk, getting people to understand that they do have common interests.
Well, we have more questions than we had time to ask, and if your question didn't get addressed, please take some time afterward during the reception to talk to Manuel directly. One last one, though, because I think that last story is where I personally would like to leave this, is I'd like you to give all of us an example, one example of where a public-private partnership has really worked, that has come up from the ground, or perhaps it came from the top down. But I think it's good to end on that positive note, because I think there are a lot of people who feel that there is a lot that we can all do and do constructively. So one more good story.
So, you know, there's really quite a few here that could be thought about. But let me end with a story that I think will be interesting, because I want to tie back to this issue about these conversations about race and how they can be uncomfortable. Shortly after I moved back to Los Angeles in the fall of 2007, I was asked by a group in South LA called Community Coalition, not Community Coalition, Scope, to come and do a meeting on black-brown changes in South LA. And I did the meeting with Karen Bass, who was at the time a state assembly person, went on to be the first African-American leader of a state assembly, and is now a congresswoman. And I've known Karen for years, so we get up to talk. There was about 250 people in this audience. And we talk about the history of South LA. We talk about the processes of deindustrialization and how people lost jobs and how that led to the crack cocaine epidemic and the rise of the gangs. And at the same period of time that there's deindustrialization, there's these new immigrants and people come in, and what are people? So we talked through all this stuff. And this was a conversation that emerged then about race that was not like a conversation you have in the philanthropic world or in the academic world. It wasn't polite. So we get done, you know, we've worked together, we say some pretty positive things. One hand goes up, young African-American guy goes, you know, I used to like Mexicans. I just don't like these new Mexicans. And then another person says, you know, the problem is these young African-American guys don't want to work, and the immigrants do. That was the best conversation we had. We talked for another hour about all the feelings that people had, about what was true about them, about what was false about them, etc. Flash forward 2 years later. That meeting was actually a meeting to launch a campaign to create green jobs in Los Angeles. But they knew they could only launch the campaign if they first dealt with the racial tensions that existed in the community. So out of that meeting came a plan to lobby the city for a municipal ordinance to mandate the retrofitting of buildings to green standards, something places like Santa Cruz would adore. But that would be tied to that would be the creation of job programs that targeted kids and young people who were not currently part of the labor force, and in particular African American Latino folks, particularly from South LA, which is a very mixed area demographically. So out of this tough conversation about black and brown comes green. Out of this tough conversation around race comes green jobs. Out of this tough conversation about what people feel about one another comes a real set of public policy concerns that wound up bringing together developers, that wound up bringing together foundations to fund the organizing, that wound up bringing together community organizers, that wound up bringing together unions, craft unions that historically been dominated by older whites who were looking out and realizing that the new workers would be African Americans and Latinos, and that they better try to be bringing them in through these apprenticeship programs now. So don't shy away from the tough conversations, because out of those tough conversations can eventually come the good, the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So thanks.
Thank you very much. And please feel free to join us outside, and we have some refreshments, and you can talk to Manuel, and if you like a copy of his book, it's out there as well. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.